Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Energy Institute Live's webinar today, covering very important topics, very timely topics around the changing energy demands and implications for infrastructure and storage. I'm really pleased to be the host and the chair for this next 90 minutes, where we're going to hear from key people from across the industry to give you some real highlights and hints of what needs to be changing in order for us to see this energy transition. My name's Nina Skrupska, and the reason that I'm chairing this session is I'm the Chief Executive of the Renewable Energy and Clean Technology Association. Many of you will know me know this organization as the REA because we've been around for close to 20 years. I'm also pleased to be hosting this because I'm also a fellow of the Energy Institute. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an insight of what's going to be covered in the next 90 minutes. We are really pleased that this webinar is being sponsored by the Energy Systems Catapult. So we're going to be hearing from Dr. Alex Buchman in a few moments and giving an overview of the work that they're doing and the importance of this sector. And then a little bit later, we're going to be joined by 5 further people to join this panel. Juliet Davenport from Good Energy, Julian Leslie from National Grid, Ross Ramsey from Mott MacDonald, and Chris Buckland from Lightsource BP. And then Alex will be joining that panel as well. I'm going to be posing them some questions directly, but also we want to hear what your questions are too. So the Q&A session will start around about 12 o'clock, and then we will be able to consider and answer all of your queries. And so this is a real opportunity for you to learn. So these are the important things I think you need to know, that if you want to know more about the speakers, they'll introduce themselves to you as well when we go into the panel session. Then you can have a look at that on the online program. We really advise, that you think about what you would like to learn and pose those questions anytime during the session, and hopefully I will get around to asking them for you. This webinar is recorded, and a link of this will be sent to everyone afterwards. So the corollary of the fact that it's recorded, this is not Chatham House rules. So please be aware of that. And the other aspect really is, because this topic is so timely, things are happening as we speak. Today, we're going to be imminently hearing the latest release of the National Infrastructure Strategy. And why it's good to hear that, because energy storage now is being revisited by them. It's only 4.5 years ago that the newly formed National Infrastructure Commission published one of their very first reports on smart power. In fact, it came back out in 2016, and it came out with some of those really revelationary statements that if energy storage played an important role that was complementary to the burgeoning growth in the renewable energy sector from wind and solar that was showing back then such promise, there would be chances that if we did things differently, we could be saving the consumer ultimately on the bill by several billion. I think the number was 8 billion. But we'll hear more about that from our panelists. And as your chair, I now want to take that opportunity to introduce our first speaker from the sponsor, from the Energy Systems Catapult, and that's Dr. Alex Buchman. So Alex, if you'd like to come to the stage, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Great. Morning, everyone. My name is Alex Buchman, and I'm the practice manager for networks and energy storage at Energy Systems Catapult. So I want to use this introduction for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to tell you a bit about the Energy Systems Catapult, but also to set the scene for the topic that we'll be discussing today. So Energy Systems Catapult was set up to accelerate the transformation of the UK's energy system and ensure UK businesses and consumers capture the opportunities of clean growth. We're one of 9 catapults established, which are overseen and part funded by Innovate UK. And some of the activities that we do, it's a broad range of stuff we do, but they include innovator support, research, trials, modelling and simulation. So at the heart of everything we do is a whole systems view, joining up the system from sources of energy to the consumer, breaking down silos between different parts of the energy system, such as electricity, heat and transport, and joining up the physical requirements of the system with policy, market and digital arrangements. So moving on to today's subject, why is it important that we address the implications of changing energy demands on infrastructure and storage? Well, we can start by having a look at what we currently have, which is a system that is both dependent upon and built around the flexibility and transportability of energy-dense fossil fuels. So if we look at flexibility to start with, just as a kind of an indicative figure, in the 6 warmest months of the year, we use approximately 200 terawatt hours less gas than in the coldest 6 months. And how do we make up this deficit? Well, we import LNG, we import gas, recycle our gas storage, the smallest of which stores over 1 terawatt hour of gas. And meanwhile, if we look at the flexibility within the electricity system specifically, when we really need it, such as in the chart on the bottom right, which is from the Beast from the East in 2018, over 80% of our flexibility is provided through fossil fuels. So fossil fuels also provide over 90% of demand turn up in the balancing mechanism. Short-term operating reserve is over 90% fossil fuels, and the capacity market for 21-22 is 70% fossil fuels, and fast reserve is around 85% fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are not only fantastic energy vectors for storing energy, but they're also relatively easy to transport, which is why over 90% of homes have a gas connection, and this is supplied by nearly 300,000 kilometres of pipe. And also why close to the 800,000 kilometres of electricity network has largely been designed to provide small loads that aren't heating, but that's going to change. So if we go on to the next slide, so how might these demands change? So basic service demands, so our need for comfort and our need for transport, they're not likely to change too much. Our desire for warmer homes might creep up over time in line with the historic economic prosperity trends. And we'll probably continue to have appliances and gadgets in our homes that need charging. We may have some sort of modal shift of transport away from private vehicles, but it's generally accepted that the underlying demands aren't likely to change too much. So for infrastructure and storage, the main implications of demand changes are how these service requirements are translated into physical transactions throughout the energy system. These can be generalized by vector, location, scale, and profile. So if we take vector, simply put, future services will be delivered by different or new low carbon energy vectors. So transport won't be delivered by petrol or diesel, but will likely to be electricity and hydrogen, combination of which across different forms of transport. Heat won't be natural gas, but will be some sort of combination of electricity, heat networks, hydrogen, and maybe others like biomass and syngas. Currently, the gas and electricity systems are largely independent of each other, save for the consumption of gas in thermal power stations. But in the future, the location of these demands and the end demands on networks will be more numerous and more complex to operate. So electricity could be consumed by heat pumps feeding heat networks, for example. Rapid charging stations could be along motorways. Potential for the heavy duty, if there's somewhere for trucks, they could be even connected to the transmission system. And electrolyzers and other power to X technologies might also be some other demands are located throughout the system. Gas may still be used, but it's likely to be used for hydrogen production facilities with CCS. and demand from a single appliance may even share energy vectors if we deploy hybrid boilers with low carbon gas peaking for an electricity baseload. So the scale of demand on the energy vectors will also change and increase particularly across electricity, hydrogen, and district heating to compensate for that reduction in gas, coal, and petroleum. So for example, in our recent Innovating to Net Zero report, we developed two plausible scenarios called Clockwork and Patchwork, one of which nearly doubled electricity supply in a year, whilst the other increased it by nearly 2.5 times, even when factoring various types of energy efficiency improvements. However, when it comes to storage and infrastructure, especially when it comes to the size of the pipes and the wires moving energy around, the profile of the changing demand is likely to be the most important part. So a peaky system is an expensive system, and so our ability to manipulate demands and use storage to control demands at different network levels across each vector will influence the infrastructure that we need to support a net zero energy system. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing at the Catapult in this area. If we start at the national scale, we've developed a suite of national host system energy modelling tools, one of which is called the Storage and Flexibility Model. And this allows us to design least cost energy systems over the coming decades to meet the 2050 net zero target, whilst seeing how storage and flexibility across all vectors and network levels can be used on an hour-to-hour basis, as well as how it can be used to provide frequency services within those hours. We've also been using our new infrastructure transitions analysis model to quantify the amount, the type, the location, and the cost of fixed energy infrastructure transitions through the country needed within these least cost energy system designs. Everything from the number of heat interface units within people's homes for heat networks, to the length of 11 kV overhead electricity network, to the amount of new build hydrogen network of different pressures and pipe sizes, all quantified into a bill of quantities and then costed. So focus down onto a particular place, and we work with local authorities and other local areas to design local area energy plans in consultation with local stakeholders, and that meet the local needs whilst aligning with national targets. We also work with innovators that can support the delivery of those net zero energy systems, helping them to climb the TRL scale towards commercialization. And across all of this, we ensure that our work can provide the evidence needed to help inform policy, market, and regulatory changes needed as we transition to net zero. So with that, I'll hand back to Nina to begin the panel discussion on this really challenging but vitally important topic. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. That's really, really enlightening, and it's great to hear the strides of the work that the Catapult are delivering. So let's bring some more people into this conversation. And we've got, like I mentioned earlier, we've got a great panel. And one by one, I'd like to introduce you to them, and they'll say a few minutes about themselves and their background and their interests before we then go into the panel session. So the first person I'd like to invite is Juliet Davenport, the CEO of Good Energy. Juliet.
Good morning, Nina, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you to Energy Systems Catapult for your overview of some of the real challenges of this market. I founded Good Energy 20 years ago. My background is I'm a climate scientist, and I was interested in trying to create a business that would put itself in the future, in a sense, consider a business model around 100% renewable electricity. And what would we need to do to deliver that? And I think our journey's been quite interesting over the last 20 years, going from the UK market was at about 2% electricity generated from renewables when we entered. It's closer to 40, possibly even getting closer to 50 now. And that transformation has been fascinating to watch in terms of how has it been achieved and what's gone on so far. But I think it also sets us up now to think about what are the transformations that we're going to need to go forwards. And I think for us, it fits into four main areas. One is R&D and innovation. Is a key area that we need to invest in low carbon. Understanding the infrastructure around low carbon. We built our energy system in heat, electricity, and transport around a high carbon world. And the new world will be a low carbon world. So what does that mean for our electricity networks? What does that mean for our gas networks? what does it mean for our road networks as well? And then obviously our marketplaces, the marketplace in the energy sector has changed several times, particularly in the electricity market. But as we move into the next stage, when renewables and net zero carbon technologies become the majority in the market rather than the minority, the marketplace needs to behave differently, making sure it's providing long-term investment signals for people coming into this market. And then finally, this is a time I think we're going to see the consumer become much more important, and Good Energy's always put consumer next to technology, in a sense, at the heart of our business model. And that is about supporting people to generate power in their own homes, use power in a different way, whether it's through electric vehicles or heating. And looking at the CCC work, the Climate Change Committee work, it demonstrates that I think at least 60% of what we need to do to get to net zero is going to need some interaction with consumers. And our vision is to make sure those consumers are protected and they have simple and easy ways to become part of this market. So overall, I mean, Good Energy, what we see is to be able to move to the next steps of this net zero, we need a combination of all of these things. It is not a technological solution on its own. It needs to embrace a wide range of technological solutions. It needs to embrace the networks and infrastructure that underpin those, and the marketplaces that those operate in, and then finally making sure the consumer is at the heart of it. And that's what we've been doing for 20 years, and that's what we hope to do for at least another 20 years. Thank you, Nina.
Thanks, Juliet. Can I now introduce the next panelist, which is Julian Leslie, Head of Networks of National Grid, who's a chartered engineer and has had nearly 30 years of operating and working on our transmission system. So welcome, Julian.
Great, thanks, Nina. Morning, everybody. Good to be here. Just quickly, I mean, I've been with the National Grid electricity system operator, both here in the UK and in the US for almost 30 years. I'm now in a privileged position where I'm leading our activities to ensure that when the market delivers us a zero carbon solution in 2025, that we as the national transmission system operator will be able to operate that system without having to procure services from fossil fuel driven generation sites. So today on a windy day, we have to constrain off the wind to constrain on the gas-fired power station to provide inertia, frequency management, etc. So we're working really hard on our zero carbon operation by 2025 ambition. Those of you close to us in the market will see that we have published various pathfinders over the last 12 months, which again is beginning to sort of chart our way and understand the changes and the challenges as we introduce more market solutions to solve those grid operational challenges as we get to 2025. And what we're finding is that storage is a key player in that. Certainly at the moment, it's a short-term storage providing frequency response. As we look out to the future with 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, what do we do on those windy days with all that energy? Because the onshore demand is not going to be anywhere close to that sort of output of energy requirements. So finding ways and methods that encourage not only the short-term sort of storage, but also those longer-term storage providers as well, so we can help balance the grid over the long term and not just minute by minute. So really looking forward to the conversation this morning and answering a load of questions. And with that, I'll hand back to Nina. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julian. And to go on to our next important panel speaker, can I introduce Ross Ramsey? He's a senior consultant and McDonald's project manager for the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition. We've got some great engineers here, so I'm going to hear from his experience too.
Thanks, Nina. So I'm really grateful to be part of the panel and the discussions today. I'm Ross Ramsey. I'm a senior consultant at McDonald in our low carbon team in Glasgow. For the past 15 to 16 years, my main focus has been helping end users manage their energy use. So by that, I mean the heating, the lighting, the air conditioning, the processes in commercial, industrial, and public buildings and organisations. So I'm a mechanical engineer to trade, and quite often I've had the privilege of helping these end users manage their energy and design and implement improvements to their sites and their buildings to reduce carbon and manage energy use. And in that time, I've seen a real shift in focus away from purely consideration of energy costs through to carbon reduction, and now the net zero imperative, which we're all trying to get our heads around. So there are some other reasons why I've been invited to the panel today. Within Mott MacDonald, I am the project manager for what's called the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's a collaboration between a number of organisations, both public and private, all of whom have shown leadership in terms of net zero and share the belief that a different type of response, a collaborational response, is needed of industry to help tackle the challenges that net zero represents. Finally, I was privileged to be part of the technical team for one of the main projects that this coalition undertook in 2020. So this was our Path to Zero Carbon Heat report, which I'll share with you through the chat. This took some of the 2050 heat scenarios that the Committee on Climate Change had developed and looked at them in some detail, trying to understand what the infrastructure that would be needed between now and 2050 would need in terms of its deployment, in terms of its realisation, and all the risks and challenges that would entail. So that was an extremely rewarding project. And within that, I looked specifically at the challenges of deploying end user technology. But we had a very broad, fantastic technical team contributing, and indeed it involved some of the panelists here today. So Alex from Energy Systems Catapult also contributed to that report. So I'm looking forward to the discussions, and I'll hand you back to Nina.
Thanks very much, Ross. And last but not least, can I introduce Chris Buckland, who's the Technical Director of Lightsource BP. And I'm sure he may have some views of the recent announcement yesterday from the government that confirmed that next year there will be a further CFD auction, and onshore renewables will be able to take part, such as solar and onshore wind. So, but his broad experience as Group Technical Director across all Lightsource BP jurisdictions will be able to hear about other insights going on. So Chris, welcome.
Thanks very much, Nina. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute today on the delivery side, I guess, of low carbon electricity, obviously Lightsource more in the solar space. So we started the company in 2010 to take opportunity of the UK feed-in tariff for solar. Within the UK context, we've now deployed, I think, 7 million solar modules, and we're now operating in 14 different countries under our joint arrangement with BP, who are 50% shareholder. So we have, within Lightsource, identified particular aspects in terms of deploying solar, both in this country and others, as far as increasing the amount of penetration of renewables. So that's my role within Lightsource on the innovation side, to think ahead of, say, 3 to 4 to 5 years from now, when the amount of penetration of renewables, whether it be wind, solar, or wind and solar, how we can deploy even more of this. And we've been working together with National Grid on experimental projects such as reactive power. We're also looking at virtual inertia. All of these things join together to enable Lightsource to deploy more solar and thereby displace effectively some of the carbon-based fuels going forward. We have some mini projects also involved as far as green hydrogen is concerned, together with BP, and work together with National Grid on the FES, and looking to realise some of these ambitions, whether it be the 2030 ambition for EVs or right up to 2050, when hopefully we become completely carbon free. So I certainly look forward to this discussion, and pass back to Nina to join up the team. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you so much for that, Chris. And maybe can I invite everybody now to switch on their cameras to join the panel properly, and also Alex, if you'd like to rejoin us on the panel too. So in this panel session, I'm really pleased that we're going to be talking about essentially not just the challenges, but the art of the possible of this new future that we're wanting to see with these changing energy demands. I don't know if you all recall, but yeah, how many years ago were we thought that if 10% of the power generation came from renewable sources, there was a prediction that the whole infrastructure would fall over. How much has that changed in terms of that view? But as we're focusing on infrastructure, I'm going to go to Julian first and ask him, how will the infrastructure and storage need to change to support this net zero ambition that, you know, the electricity system operator are really boldly saying you'll be able to operate net zero by 2025? Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Sure, thanks, Nina. And I think there's three key elements where storage can really play a part in how we operate the grid system. The first ones I mentioned already is those really short-term services that we need to manage frequency response, voltage management, hopefully some virtual sort of inertia products also. And I think it's those where you can define very clearly the need, the magnitude and the duration, and therefore the investment case alongside our markets and the contracts that we're issuing make that investment case really pretty straightforward. So that's the first sort of need, that very short-term use. As you then look out into the longer-term storage, as an alternative to network investment, we've got a huge amount of offshore wind coming on the East Coast, a huge amount of wind already in Scotland, and more to be growing. The infrastructure alone over the next 10 years is going to be in the region of £11 billion that our network optioneering assessment sort of process delivers every year, so supporting that £11 billion worth of investment. If, however, you can consume the energy closer to the source, then you don't need to transmit that energy south to where the demand is. So therefore, there's something there, I think, that we have run a congestion management pathfinder where we've gone to industry to say, what are your ideas as to how we might solve this conundrum? Do we continue to invest in very large scale subsea cables offshore? Or is there another way where we can consume the demand on those windy days more locally and negate the need for so much transmission investment? Now, whether that's storage of storing electricity in a battery, for example, and reproducing the electricity hours later, or whether it's taking the energy off the system and converting it to another source of energy, such as hydrogen or ammonia, which is then helping to decarbonize some of those harder to reach energy systems also. And then finally, and thirdly, it is just our long-term balancing, I think. How do we ensure that when we have the 5 or 6 days and the deepest, darkest, coldest winter where we don't have a lot of wind on the system, how do we ensure that we have the source of energy there waiting so we can sort of fulfill that balance of energy need during those long periods of low wind and low solar output? I think really for us, storage can play is already playing a very active part in the short-term requirements. We're running a pathfinding now to look at how it can be used as an alternative to network investment. But the bit that certainly I'm not aware of National Grid is looking at currently is that longer term sort of energy balance in the market.
No, I think the story for short-term energy storage as playing a role and capability over the last few years, we've built that confidence, and it's with projects and modelling by, you know, the Energy Systems Catapult and the roles that everybody on this panel are playing that are giving us more and more confidence. But is it the longer term storage areas that we've still got more to do on? I'm adding this as a little extra question for you, Julian, before I push this out round further to other panelists' views.
I think for me it's that, how do we give the market signal that the investment is required? So at the moment, through the Pathfinder projects, we're sort of entering into 9 or 10 year bilateral contracts following a tender process. But really, to me, that should be driven by the market. The market should be able to see the need and make that investment based on the market information that's available to them.
Thank you.
I think that is one area that really needs the work and the investment signals and the clarity to make that come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, what do you think? Because you've already been saying on this, how will the infrastructure and storage needs to change to support net zero? You've already been trialing, you know, some of these services, these very important services, and I think everybody who are listening today might not realise how important those different services are as we transition to a much renewable powered or low carbon future. What do you think are
Yeah.
the challenges there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as Julian said, the short term in terms of voltage controls and thus enabling more electricity down the same cable, work has been done around there, and the projects are out there. The same for probably for inertia, which would enable turning off some more of the coal. And I think we're running 1.2 gigs of coal as we speak today, right now, unfortunately, to provide that inertia. So those parts, we are experimenting from the light source BP side because we believe that there will be a significant market pull, if you want to call it that, or a commercial justification behind that, bearing in mind that we are privately funded and not government funded. Going beyond that onto the longer term storage, I think the positive side is the kinds of technologies we're talking about, which could be ammonia, could be hydrogen produced from renewable sources. All of those technologies are available now. It's not as if we have to invent something new. What we need to identify, or what we would be advised to look at, is to try and establish a market pool for investors and for people who deploy solar and or wind, such as ourselves. And that market pool can be defined either as a mandate. Now, for example, you are not allowed to build solar unless you include batteries. This is a bit how the US is doing it. Or there can be commercial drivers behind it. And the UK is very agile as an economy. You think about how quickly onshore wind came to market, and equally how quickly solar was in the UK. All of that was driven by a market pool identified through policy. Now, we have, through Catapult and through the various government support schemes for experimentals, we have a lot of opportunity to try things. But to industrialize, I think, as Julian was saying, we need to identify within the fiscal framework a market pool. And if the market pool would be, for example, 5% of natural gas can be displaced with hydrogen today, which is the fact, and that would be sold effectively on the market, at market as a feed-in tariff or as a ROC or potentially as a CFD. That would accelerate us from these piloting to deployment at scale. I think that's really going to be the driver to get to where we need to be within the next decade or two. And otherwise, we will continue experimenting and trialing, but not deploying.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to be covering the whole range of things from what the panelists will be covering, just for the audience, if they're wondering why aren't we talking about the consumer just yet or anything like that. We will get to it, I promise you. But I'm going to now ask Ross about what are the challenges from what you've seen and the projects that you've been engaged in to the infrastructure and to storage deployment. What would you say the top 2 or 3 challenges are?
Where to start? Yeah, so from some of the recent projects that I've been involved in, the key challenges that we'd identified have been, first of all, the rapid deployment of some of the critical technologies that will be needed in our new energy system as we go towards 2050. So some of the technologies that we've evaluated that are not or haven't really been deployed at scale would include the carbon capture and utilisation and storage. Perhaps if we're going to be generating substantial volumes of hydrogen through reforming, at least in the early years, autothermal reforming as well, some of these technologies too, and also some forms of new nuclear and floating wind, and also HVDC cables. They need to be, we need to build the supply chain for all these technologies, and we need to very rapidly over the next 10 years demonstrate that they can be deployed at scale. So that's one way to look at it. The other thing that perhaps interests me most of all is the end user challenges in terms of linking with the infrastructure that we're talking about. So all of the information that we have reviewed would suggest that both heat pumps and heat networks or district heating will play quite a large role in our future energy system. At the moment, the supply chains to be able to deliver, for example, let's say 1 million heat pumps in the course of a year for deployment just aren't there in the UK, although we've come on leaps and bounds in that respect. And I would stress as well, as an end user specialist, that it's very easy to make or to implement heat pumps in a bad way where they don't achieve the efficiencies that they're intended to do, and even more so where you have a more complex system like hybrid heat pumps, which could also be part of the mix. So we need to build our skills in these areas, and we need to build our capacity to deploy these technologies in a reliable manner, which builds consumer confidence, which means that our very tight timelines towards 2050 can be met, and that these technologies can be deployed at scale in a confident manner.
Okay, you know, you've gone across the full range of the gamut of technologies that we know are going to be of interest to the government, you know, and we know from a policy point of view, we're still waiting to hear the energy white paper, a hydrogen strategy, and so on. But maybe I'll pick up to Juliet now and ask and bring you into the conversation. What do you think of the low regret options that can be done now, which can contribute to the net zero energy system? And I'll ask others as well on that question too. But Juliet.
Well, I mean, I think, as you said, we've touched on a lot of technologies. I mean, just following on from Ross's point, I was on a seminar recently talking about consumer confidence, and what's very stark is actually consumers do expect the regulator to be part of this conversation. They expect that this market is regulated and that their interests are protected. And so I do think there is a role that we need to identify of how do we protect consumers in this area, because then they're not going to suddenly become technical experts overnight and be able to understand whether a heat pump is well deployed or not well deployed. And so you can see the space, the gap for horror stories coming out of the press, and you can read the headlines straight away. And I think this is, when I was talking at the beginning, I mean, I think each of the panelists have touched on R&D is really important, and 2.7% of GDP is a lot of money to spend. We need more of it in the energy sector. The networks are absolutely key, and we've talked about the electricity networks, but also making sure we've got the EV charging points, charge point networks, and understanding how that integrates with everything else. The marketplace, consumers are going to be a much more important part of this marketplace than they've ever been. And I think understanding where we deploy these technologies, that we really, what we found is in the EV market, so we part own a company called ZapMap, which has got a lot of data on EV drivers in the UK. And what that says is that the early adopter EV drivers are not fussy. So they love technology. They will love the gadgets. If it occasionally doesn't work, they don't mind, because they've got the newest technology, because they're happy to play with it. Quite often you find they might actually be engineers in the background, so they're quite happy to look at spreadsheets. The next set of consumers are going to be incredibly fussy. They're going to want it to work. They're not going to have. They want their customer services to be really impressive, and they'll want it just to plug and play and do what they expect it to do. And I think this is the step that we need to make sure that full stage is integrated. And where we've seen issues is really regulation does get in the way. Consumer protection is not really thought of properly. So, for example, the Ombudsman is not really involved in this question at the moment. And I think that that part of this, we need a complete rethink about how we deploy fast at scale and make sure that that's not going to become a blocker in the longer term.
Thanks for that. Thank you for that. Sorry, I was unmuting at the same time then. Online burper there. Yeah, I think you're talking on topics that are very close to my heart, as you know, Juliet. You know, the representing renewable energy and clean technology. One of the worst things that could happen to a sector is when the experience of the people who you want to encourage to move into it is not a positive one, and it will set things back. But I think we're on our way, and all the consumer codes, protections, role of the regulator is a key aspect in making sure that's the whole approach. Maybe I can come back to Chris again and ask you, what do you think the low regret options are that can be done now, which we can contribute? You know, not thinking 4, 5 or 10 years ahead for the net zero big challenge, because when people say we will do things by 2050, sometimes people think this is like kicking the can down the road and we don't have to do anything today. But what do you think are the important low regret things at this moment in time?
I think there's, well, first of all, I'd like to pick on Juliet's point. The end user, particularly the domestic end user, I think there's quite a lot that we can do to encourage and on the enthusiasm of the engineers who have picked this up. We're going to see clearly with the EV rules or demonstration from the government last week, or was it the week before, that EV charging is now going to be accelerated over and beyond just the motorway. It's going to be the domestic. Now that has to be a golden opportunity for the off-takers, for the domestic consumer, to become smart. Home energy management systems, whether it's your Google Home system or an equivalent, for sure that has to be a short-term opportunity on the back of the EV situation that we're going to go through in the UK. That will make us a little bit more sophisticated, possibly, but most people have smartphones, and most people then will be presumably want an app to charge and discharge their cars, and then they'll be able to trade. So Good Energy and those kinds of organisations will be able to take advantage of that. And the off-takers it's a good opportunity for the off-takers to start to participate in the energy system. On the industrial scale deployment of renewables, there are a few relatively easy things, some of these blocking points, such as the 50 megawatt limit, before we have to go to government for approval. That is beginning to become more relaxed, and so certainly Solar Trade Association is lobbying the government to make that even easier going forward. So there are a few legislative limitations. I think that also, however, what we are seeing is there's quite a lot of opportunity to work with DNOs as well as National Grid to look at the ability to deploy more of these renewables in areas of the grid that's currently under the levels of safety. So we can only use this amount of the cable because of the rest we need in reserve. If we're a bit smarter around that area, those are relatively easy to deal with by putting in extra sensors on the transmission or distribution line, then we can deploy more solar in areas where currently there are limitations. Another classic area that we are identifying as light source outside of the UK is sharing. Now, it's co-location, wind and solar, for example. Wind and solar sharing part of the network. If at the moment, if wind has that part of the network, then it's closed. That connection point is closed to solar. And the same, if solar has this, then wind doesn't have it. As it happens, particularly in the UK, it's windier in winter when it's less sunny, and it's sunnier, less windy in the summer when the sun's shining. So the regrets of sharing wind and solar financially and in terms of generation is absolutely minimal. However, there is not a system available from the network providers and or National Grid to allow that dual form of location. And we can get capacity factors from solar from 14% up to beyond 50% by co-locating onshore wind and solar. And in Australia, we can get up to 70%. Offshore wind and solar co-located is an interesting one for hydrogen, because then that only leaves 30% of the gap of 365 days a year that needs to be filled. And actually, that 30% could be filled by recycling hydrogen. And all of a sudden, the intermittency aspect of renewables just disappears. That's a slightly longer play, Nina, but it's very logical that we can get to a higher level of penetration with some relatively simple modifications of today's grid code, for example.
Okay, well, that really ties me into my next question. But before I ask the question, can I just remind the audience that if you've got any questions, please do direct them to me in the Q&A panel. I can ask questions all the way through to 12:30 of this fantastic panel, but we want to hear what you really want to be able to for me to ask the panel, because this is your opportunity to really delve down deep into some of the areas that are of interest to you. So I'm going to bring Alex back in, who's quietly sat there after giving his presentation right at the beginning. So I'm going to ask that question is, how will the interaction between energy networks change in a net zero energy system? And Julian, you can be priming yourself ready as the next person to answer that, and then it'll be a free-for-all on that topic. But Alex, maybe you can enlighten us what the views from the Energy System Catapult.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the work that we do, and certainly what that I do, is around kind of the long-term whole system decarbonisation kind of modelling, looking at how we can decarbonise for least costs. And so when you look at that and you look at, I don't know, you get these Sankey diagrams that show where energy comes from, where it flows to, and where those transformations happen in the system. You can see that in least cost decarbonised systems, that are kind of market agnostic. They're literally trying to get the most technically feasible and least cost system. You're getting a lot more interactions in between the supply and the demand. And so, and you can imagine, for example, that rather than having a kind of very large battery to manage some forms of electricity constraints, you might be able to use the far cheaper hot water storage that is embedded within heat networks in order to manage some electricity services, for example. Or you might want to use electrolysis to create hydrogen in order to avoid curtailment, which we don't really do at the moment too much, and is an idea that's passed around. But then, as we mentioned before, you've also got that potentially complicated relationship at the behind the meter level, where you have hot water tanks, and you have hybrid boilers, and you have potentially domestic batteries, all kind of interplaying with each other. And so one of the key areas that I feel that this kind of interaction, this more complex interaction, brings up, one of the challenges is around how we operate those fairly, and so how we kind of recover costs fairly to the consumer in terms of providing a service, say a service of comfort, whilst also enabling the sufficient infrastructure to deliver that service and recovering those costs across different networks. So that'd be my view.
I think this is one of the interesting factors, that we're on a journey and we're transitioning, and different organizations are at different parts of that journey. And for me, it's about what are the important aspects that we really need to resolve and knock down that barrier in order for us to accelerate that transition. I promised I'd come back to you, Julian, about go back to some of the things that you were saying. You've got an ambition as the transmission operator to be and operate with no barriers for net zero by 2025. But what are those barriers that we need to see happen to live that world that Alex and Juliet portrayed, for the consumers to feel a really seamless service in the things that they want to do? Julian? Sorry. It's almost like the gazillion billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. I mean, in terms of getting to 2025, obviously our ambition is that for a few hours on a sunny Sunday afternoon, we'll be able to operate the grid system at zero carbon. So it's a step on the way, and we'll demonstrate that we've got the mechanisms in place and we have enough stability and inertia and frequency response in the system in order to deliver that. As you look out to 2030 and beyond there, the challenge just grow from there. When you move from a few hours of zero carbon operation to a weekend, to a week, to a month, to a season, and then obviously throughout the year, that's where the challenges really come, because you're looking at that, balancing that long-term weather pattern with a long-term sort of demand or storage sort of product. I mean, I agree with Alex. I think that increasing demand in those high wind areas on those high wind days to convert the wind energy into other forms of low carbon, zero carbon energy, which can then either be stored and then used back on the electricity system, or actually moved on into another energy system, whether that be transport, whether it's heat, or shipping even. I was talking to someone the other day how they can decarbonise shipping in Scotland by consuming the excess wind. So I think, but it's that whole energy piece, isn't it? And it's who is coordinating that, whose role is it to sort of make all these things come together, and where you can make those cost-benefit trade-offs between investing in an electricity network versus investing in a transport network or a heat network. And just really, I mean, I think organisations like the Energy Catapult are fantastic in sort of bringing these pieces together. But where do we go in government with these great ideas to say, well, actually, we can do this on one hand, this impact over here, and how do we get the policy and the framework and the regulation in place in order to make all of that happen in a seamless whole system basis? You're on mute.
Thank you. Apologies, I've done another blooper there as the chair. I would like to advocate that the REA, the fact that we represent renewable energy across power, heat and transport, has a little bit of that coordinating oversight as well. Maybe not the in-depth wholesale whole system modeling that the Energy Systems Catapult to, but boy, have we got the 500 plus members who are those disruptor technologists that can see some real opportunities. But you creating the framework and the opportunity as a system operator, but the role of the DNOs in there, this is the question I would like to ask maybe Ross on the views of that, or Juliet. What more do they need to be doing now? Some of the things that our members suggest, who are energy storage players, that we need to see the deeper flexibility, coherent markets, so that they can then find a way to fund those projects and invest in it. So if anybody'd like to contribute to that, then you know, whether it's Chris or whether it's Ross, please let me hear what your thoughts are. Do you want to start, Ross? I'm going to point fingers since I'm the chair, but maybe let's hear what you think from a consumer point.
Yes, so the role of the DNOs and the regulators. I think Alex made a really interesting point earlier on about how we socialise those costs and how the differences in costs may vary across the UK, particularly if we move towards a more hybrid energy system where we have a range of different options deployed in a range of different areas. Will be interesting. I think that one of the things that we could get greater clarity on from the DNOs, and it would involve other parties as well, would be the role of central government in defining a top-down plan to what's going to happen in terms of our energy infrastructure, but also, and this is a key point where there are tensions, but there are also opportunities, the role of regions and of cities and of local authorities, and how all of these parties will come together to actually deploy and decide where these technologies are actually going to be implemented. It's been mentioned earlier on today that I think Alex is focused, and no doubt is focused on other aspects as well, but in identifying the lowest cost energy infrastructure that's possible. But there are other ways to look at how we should implement this as well. Perhaps there are other options or other variations on our energy infrastructure which could yield greater social benefits. From the end user point of view, there may be other considerations, for example, the deployment of low carbon heat in conservation areas where there will be particular sensitivities, and obviously cost can't be the only consideration in these types of places as well. So I think that as well as developing a plan, we need to have a framework for engagement between all these different parties, the regulators, the DNOs, central government, and also crucially local authorities, cities and regions as well. I don't know if that directly answers your question there, Nina, but
Nina, I'm happy to come in as well. Is that okay?
Oh, I was going to come next to you, Juliet, on this point, and then maybe because one of the questions I haven't asked the whole panel before I go to some of the questions that are now coming in will be about innovation and that. But please do on this topic about how do we bring it all together. Go ahead, Juliet.
So I think, I mean, particularly coming to the distribution networks and getting closer to the consumer, one of the things I've seen in this market over the 20 years is I call it the belief factor. So I think when we started out in the market, there were, I'm not saying necessarily in the energy market, but definitely politically, there were people who didn't believe wind turbines worked. There were also later on, probably about 10 years later, there were people that believed that the UK isn't sunny, so solar panels don't work. And I think we're at a bit of a stage with that as well in terms of households and what sort of the fact that we've got 1 million households that are essentially small power stations in the UK. What is the potential for the other side of the meter? Where does that go? And I think that is quite a challenge because also we've got the national transmission network, as Julian talked about, we've got the distribution network, which is a connectivity there. And then you've got the other side of the meter. And I think it's this belief piece that we need to understand more and what happens on the demand side response, because I still hear it today that there is a fear that unless we have a big button to push on a very big power station, that things will not work. And I think that's one of the things that R&D and the Energy Systems Catapult could do a lot of work to help. I think the other thing is that we are trying to drive a behaviour, and what we've done to zero carbon, which means using less fossil fuels. And what we've done over the last 20 years is put all the costs of moving to zero carbon on the electricity bill. And so therefore, when you try and compare a technology that could replace a gas installation, it looks very expensive. And that's because there's no additional costs of essentially what's been zero carbon going on the gas bill. And there's this massive distribution discrepancy. And I also think there's a lot of things coming through distribution charging reviews as well, where we've seen what we think is a backward step, actually, people encouraged to use more power, not less, and very little time of day sort of indicators or sort of directions coming through on the bill. So I think we need to really review how engaged the consumer can become, how the small homes can become more of a power station, and what that could then do to help Julian rather than hinder Julian in trying to fix the national level. Because when you've got a windy grid that you're trying to plug in at a national level, if the grid underneath it, if you're the other side of the meter is pulling in the opposite direction, it makes life a lot harder. If you can get them to pull in the same direction, life will become a lot easier.
Thanks, Julia. In fact, there's one of the questions that came in on the chat box, which I'll just refer to now, which is from Ivan Harling. He said, with this globally driven drive towards low carbon, what can we do to try and get some joined up thinking between the national strategy here in the UK and local planning departments when it comes to trying to get over the choices being made, like planning hurdles? So I'm almost thinking that this question is really about how do we get everybody aligned and believing, not think somehow in my head I'm thinking of believers, but we need believers in the energy transition, that there is a role to play. How could we do that? I mean, Juliet, you've already given your thoughts, but maybe I can come back to Ross and Chris about that.
Yeah, I can pick up on that, Nina. So I think one of the things that strikes me about the energy system that we're talking about will be the complexity of it. So we're talking about all these new technologies that we'll be applying at large scale in terms of the infrastructure. And even at the end user level, if we talk about things like behind the meter storage and hybrid heat pumps, where you have not one, but two potential sources of heat in an individual dwelling or a commercial building, be it what may, we are taking a step forward in terms of the complexity of our energy system, particularly if you have these demand side management measures put in place as well. And I think that what we really need is some demonstration at scale to show that this can work and it won't end up as a dreadful mess at the end of the day. So projects that take a whole district and a town and convert them to heat pumps, and show that all these different technologies can work without any great disruption to people's satisfaction with their end use technologies, could be a real step forward. That was something that I would definitely advocate in the short term as a low regrets measure.
Thanks for that.
I'd like to pick up on Ross's point, and absolutely, I think one way to domestic users to engage more potentially is to show them that it works, and this local authority approach, for example, and it could be at governmental level, to electrify or energy manage a village, a district, a town, very similar to the work BP is doing with smart cities. That absolutely would give a level of engagement. You could imagine where I am, South Hertfordshire, saying, okay, schools, hospitals, we are going to convert you to heat pumps. And by the way, the EV charge points will be on this balancing system. We have a central management. And as soon as the domestic users see this in their daily life, electric buses going past, hydrogen buses being filled up, I think that using that form of demonstrator, not piloting, but real demonstrator in terms of thousands of people in that environment and seeing that it works, and potentially, clearly, those local authorities taking advantage of that, either through funding and or other green certificates. I think that would be a great way to go, and certainly outside of the UK, as mentioned, that's one of the approaches that BP is taking to green cities. As a concept, and then bring the inhabitants of those cities along for the ride and to see it all working.
There are some fantastic demonstration projects, and Juliet highlighted the importance of R&D, and the government's actually throwing an awful lot of money at R&D, but how do we make sure we don't fritter away that money, and that we can ensure that we're learning and cross-pollinating? People won't know, but I sit on the TfL's board and work in the GLA to really join up power, heat and transport delivery. There's the Midlands Engine, who are coordinating R&D and work and advocating for R&D. There's the Northern Powerhouse, and then obviously there's the devolved government. How do we ensure, as really sensible people who want to see this energy transition, and this is, I guess I'm pointing at the energy system Catapult here, how do we keep just a hold of some golden threads of pulling the learning so that we amplify that investment in all and that R&D? Maybe, Alex, you might have a view of how do you do that, and Juliet, in your other role, as I know you're on the Innovate UK board, how do we make sense of all of this? And then I'm going to go through to all the questions that are now flooding through that you guys can't see.
Yeah, that's it's a really good and deep question, that one. So I think in general, the energy systems Catapult want to try and make sure that the learning is kind of published. We want to make sure that we can learn from each other. We don't want everything to be kind of kept as everyone's own intellectual property and then hidden away. But we want the entire system to benefit from it, because at the end of the day, there's so much we need to do in so little time. There's plenty of space for everyone to have a piece of this cake. And so if we can kind of lead the kind of the conversation and say where the markets need to develop and where innovations need to happen, and then we can demonstrate and amplify the demonstrators that are happening, and then share the learnings from those demonstrators. That learning then starts to dissipate throughout the rest of the landscape, and others start taking note from it. I mean, a good example of that is around the digital space, in terms of you are seeing more and more innovators with really great ideas about how to access behind the meter flexibility in new ways and engage with consumers in new ways. And there just seems to be such a great landscape at the moment that it's just growing and growing. And I think that part of that is down to everyone being open and trying to create these open frameworks for sharing data.
Thanks. Juliet, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do, Nina. I mean, it's sort of obviously sitting on Innovate UK, I kind of see a lot of what's going on, and I've worked reasonably closely with Energy Systems Catapult and seeing the great work they've been doing. But we've done some of our own R&D projects, and I think one of the things that R&D projects can do is throw up where there is, quite often you find is the technology is very deployable. How do you put it together? And it's then what is getting in the way of making a business model out of it. So one of the projects we did was a vehicle to grid project, looking at grid support from vehicles. And obviously they're all quite small, and being able to deploy them at scale that fits the regulation is quite hard. And I think part of the job, I think, for R&D should be is really identifying the blockers from a regulatory and a market structure and a consumer point of view that goes across, as Alex is saying, that goes across everybody. We can all have our own technologies and our own ways of doing things, but there will be a common thread about identifying the blockers. And I think that probably should be a key output from some of this, is that we all want to make a business model of it. That's how we're going to get this to fly, is to be able to make a commercial model that works in this open marketplace. And every time we do a piece of R&D, that's what we should really be testing. And for me, that's true innovation. That's about taking something that kind of works in one place, adding it to something else, and then make a business model that you can roll out at scale.
Okay, there would be wrong for a panel like this talking about energy transition where I don't mention the nuclear word in a question. So one of the questions that I'm going to be posing to you, I'm just going to say one thing. I would really love, if everybody's listening to this, to stop referring to intermittency when we talk about renewable energy and talk about variable, because one of the sharpest things that the Energy System Catapult, the grid, and everybody have done now is about modeling and knowing when and how various things vary when they come onto the system. So I'm not going to read that question out in full length. Given all the ways of managing renewable intermittency the panel has talked about, does the panel see a role for nuclear in the UK's net zero energy system? And I'm going to ask for a show of hands here of who would like to take that one on. Okay, yes, Alex, go for it.
Yeah, so it's a controversial subject, isn't it? A couple of points really. Yes, in a lot of the work that we do, we kind of explore low nuclear scenarios and high nuclear scenarios, and we look at the impacts of that. And I suppose there's one kind of myth that we need to overcome a little bit. And I would say I'd also propose a new word for renewables, but it falls into a larger category, and that is essentially a little bit less flexible. And so, because at the moment we have a lot of flexible dispatchable plant, and renewables aren't so much, don't have as much flexibility, but nor does a lot of the traditional nuclear. So when you see some of that being deployed in the system, the impact, it doesn't have a huge impact on some of the key storage areas, because you still have to vary. Your demand is still varying quite a lot more than it used to around electricity demand anyway. And you still got to create that flexibility. Having said that, we've done a lot of work in the past on the small modular reactors, and also kind of recently on cogeneration from small modular reactors, and it's a really interesting area where you can potentially produce pretty low cost hydrogen. You can also produce pretty low cost heat, and if you can find those right areas with a sweet spot for small modular reactors, you can create electricity as well as hydrogen as well as heat, and it starts to link together a lot of different parts of the energy system in quite a flexible way. You're on mute.
Would anybody else like to share their views on this?
Well,
yes, Chris.
Resource BP and BP, you have a view on this. I think all of us believe there is a place for nuclear. The issue that we have in the UK with nuclear is its inflexibility. And I think we started the conversation very early here from the point of view of flexibility and the gas peakers, etc., that are in the system. So if nuclear could be flexible, then almost certainly there is a space for that in the economics and the practical aspects of that. Now, the small nuclear presumably is very flexible, and that's why we have nuclear submarines and ships and things like that. The large nuclear, as we drive it in the UK, is inflexible, and actually what's interesting is it's not very reliable. Now, less than 50% of the nuclear reactors we have currently in the UK are running, and that's been the case for most of the summer. So the intermittency of renewables possibly, come back to your point, but it's terribly predictable. If the sun doesn't come up one morning, we've got bigger problems talking about the energy challenge. And it is terribly predictable from the point of view of its reliability. So it's up there pretty much with the gas and the coal at beyond 87 up to 90%, whereas nuclear is relatively low in terms of reliability. If we can use the nuclear to, for example, generate hydrogen, then all of a sudden we have flexible nuclear, because when it's not on grid, it's producing hydrogen, and maybe we have a role for it there. But big chunky generators in the middle of nowhere, and then having to put transmission lines across the UK to be able to distribute it, yeah, a little bit of a question mark. Nonetheless, we believe that there is space for nuclear. Flexible nuclear would be absolutely ideal, because that would enable us to remove some of the carbon-based peakers effectively, that are the challenge on the system, I think, going forward. We ran 70% renewables in May of this year, unfortunately due to the COVID situation. But in order to do that, a significant amount of nuclear had to be turned off. Yeah, so it's part of the mix. And I think it has a place, has a role to play, but not the big traditional chunky stuff. That's our position.
And just in case there's any misapprehension from anybody who's listening to this, because I'm the chief exec of the Renewable Energy and Clean Tech Association, how I view the technologies as an engineer, you know, all of these technologies are engineeringly feasible. Our position in the REA is around the commerciality, the cost of it, and the role we see it playing in the future. So engineering wise, I think, you know, nuclear can be done. In fact, I used to be responsible for a nuclear power plant in the Netherlands. So, and there were big discussions there about its future. I think an interesting one I'd like to come back to now is about hydrogen. And you know, we've got a number of questions, and one of the specific questions we've got is, what array of hydrogen storage and refueling access infrastructure, if any, should we envisage for passenger and goods vehicles by 2030 and 2040? So we're touching on transport now, and there are other transport linked questions around EVs, but shall we touch on hydrogen and see if you guys are comfortable to tackle what this might mean for decarbonising transport as well? Is anybody who would like to have a go at that one? Ross, is this one for you? Oh, Juliet's put her hand up first. She wins. Okay, Juliet, go.
I'm not going to answer it all, Nina, but I think what we've already seen is, to a certain extent, definitely for passenger, is that electric is way ahead of hydrogen right now. And I think we've got more electric charging points and petrol stations now in the UK. I think that is going to continue to accelerate. We're about 1% of the UK's car fleet is now electric. And I think in last month, 10 or 12% of new vehicles were electric. So we're seeing a dramatic shift. And I think from a passenger point of view, I think that the electric side could get there quicker. What it seems to me is that electric is not as efficient in sort of in haulage, and so that for me is a space for hydrogen to start to think about, and actually would be a good place to focus on initially as a market entry.
I think very much so across the different members of the REA, we see green gas in its various forms as being targeting towards heavy goods vehicles, and also what's not in here is there's the role of hydrogen being considered in the Jet Zero ambition of the government as well, of what could that play in decarbonising aviation. And somebody also of the panel mentioned about the importance of thinking of hubs, of where you bring together a particular vector, so like for marine, but then what does the whole port need to do, and the power it needs, and then all other goods and supplies that are in there. So this holistic thinking is what we've been discussing, is very much the way forward. And unfortunately, it's more complex. So one of the next questions here is turning a little bit to money and finance. So there's a really clear acceptance from one of our attendees. He's saying it seems that there will be a technical solution to net zero for our power system, production, transmission, etc. But what financial instruments and mechanisms are being discussed to finance some of these innovative solutions, such as carbon capture, hydrogen storage? I mean, Chris, in your experience, and also Ross, in terms of the projects that you've looked at, financing and understanding the cost of that, and looking at engineering risk and regulatory risk and policy risk, do you have any insights in how we can attract investment in these areas? Chris, would you like to try first and answer that?
Absolutely. And to be honest, on the hydrogen side, this is more our big brother BP who's dealing with that. And you may have seen, I think last week, that they're looking at green hydrogen production in Germany, actually using offshore wind. So there's development work going on there. The way that BP deals with this is they have set themselves a price for carbon. Yeah. And using their own motivation then on the balance sheet effectively and reported on a quarterly basis. If you have your own cost of carbon within the company, that is how their business cases are starting these pilots along the journey. But that's an internal decision from BP. In terms of raising finance and deploying these kinds of things, you can look to, again, we can look to other places as to how they deal with it. Equivalent to light source in other countries would be EDF or NL or Scatec, for example. All of these are actually funded by Crown money. Okay, so they have very different access to cost of capital. In the US, those kinds of things are actually being controlled by tariffs. Yeah, so it's an 80% effectively import duty on solar modules into the US. So the US has its walls around its fort, and with that protection against cheap Chinese imports, etc., then they are confident within their environment to do what they need to do. So I think there are different ways to get to the end result. UK tends to be led by innovation. Yeah, we're very effective, I think, and we're very dynamic and responsive to movements within the regulatory motivation framework, as we mentioned before. But there are other ways to do it. A classic example would be Scatec, which, as I say, is funded by Crown money, and they have a different view to risk. Yeah, and they're happy to invest significant amounts of money, as, by the way, UK was looking at for carbon capture up until 2 years ago. A big chunk of money, let's get into there and let's get to industrial scale. That kind of motivation can move things along. But equally, CFDs, as you mentioned before, Nina, for next year, something that private capital can leverage against, yeah, and then take a view on the risk. That is always helpful. So there are a lot of different methods and routes to get to industrial scale.
Sorry, I think you're on mute, Nina.
Oh, okay, that's probably the 4th time I've not been in control of my mute button. I do apologise to everybody. Russ, do you have any additional thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to approach the question in a slightly tangential manner, looking at the end user aspects of creating this new energy system. So if we think of the incentives or the motivations for private investors and those who might actually implement some of these systems that we're talking about, one of the things that we found that recurrently comes up is the confidence that they have in the clients that they're dealing with. So We've talked today about the huge range of different technologies that might be deployed in this new energy system in a very complex system architecture. If we talk about public sector clients, like local authorities, like cities, like regions, they will doubtless have a role to play in the rollout of these technologies at end user level. And we need to have the confidence that they have the teams, staff, the expertise to be able to be informed clients, because that's what the investors and the vendors of these technologies will be looking for. They won't want to get involved in projects where the client is ill-informed or has misapprehensions about what they are actually getting or what they're investing in. So I think that's an important element, although it's not directly a mechanism or a financial instrument.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because one of the things we haven't talked about is knowledge, skills, and that's one of the important roles of the Energy Institute here, to help people to learn about what is going on, how fast it's going on, and the choices that they've got to engage. You know, the green energy revolution really is a revolution, and people may be fearful to think, oh well, there's no point learning more about this, but what an opportunity, as you said. But we do need to have on both sides of a contract a trusted deliverer who promises what they're going to deliver and delivers it, and on the other side, the informed buyer who can then mutually deliver a cost-effective project for the consumer overall. A little known fact, I sit on the board of TfL, and it was quite a conservative organisation, and it's just about to go out and do its first tender for power purchase agreements from renewable sources. But it's took them a few years to get to that point, because we've had to build the competencies within the organisation and also believe that this is going to be great value for money, and we're seeing, you know, the signals happening. I'm going. There's another question that's just come on. Is and actually it is a good one that we probably rounding up on. Is please could you ask the panelists how they feel about the recent government announcement, the 10-point plan? And we do know that at 12:30 the Chancellor is going to be putting out his spending review, which should give a little bit more nuances on there. So with regard, how will this help or not help the move towards renewables in the UK? And do they think this will have a positive impact on public opinion on renewables? Maybe whilst you're on, Ross, you start off, and then we'll go around the panel and hear their thoughts on this topic.
Sure. So the 10-point plan was very interesting, and I don't have the insight to judge whether or not the investment that's being proposed in a lot of these different areas is sufficient to meet the scale of the task in terms of what we're trying to achieve in net zero. But in any case, it's welcome. It's good to see progress in some of these areas. But one of the things that I found quite striking, and perhaps slightly a divergence from some of the other announcements that have been made recently, was the absence of heat networks and district heating within that 10-point plan. And it could be the case that that changes. So I believe the heat policy roadmap will be imminently revealed. Maybe there'll be more detail in that respect there. But that was quite an interesting observation, I thought, because an awful lot of the scenarios that we've reviewed involve an awful lot of district heating. So we really do need to scale that up, and that seemed to be absent. That's what I would add at this point.
Okay, thanks, Russ. I agree. We pushed out a little bit of a blog from the REA called Mind the Gap, which was around any information around heat, because there still are big gaps in there for us to be able to make a concrete whole systems approach. Chris, would you want to add what your thoughts were to about the 10-point plan?
Well, good news from the point of view is absolutely clear, even during these difficult times, that this approach and the determination of potentially using some of this program to dig us out of where we've been and the challenge we've had this year. And I think that, to be honest, is our interpretation as to the main focus, or at least 50% of the focus of this is where can the UK differentiate. We're looking at offshore wind, which we could like. We're looking at hydrogen, which we probably have quite a lot of competence and needs a bit of a push. The areas such as the heat network, and I have to say from the light source BP side, clearly there's no solar on there either, for those of you who have read it. Maybe they're not on there because they don't have this dual function of low carbon plus something that UK can be good at and potentially export. Yeah, talking Brexit and our new place in the world. That won't stop solar being deployed because it's still the cheapest energy source to be deployed. So there will be enough drivers. We within Light Source BP and BP are in the green hydrogen space, so very, very keen and enthusiastic to see that. Pick up on the Ross point, it's not an area that we're in, but clearly it's the heat networks, low-hanging fruit. There are other places, Berlin, for example, and a lot of the middle and eastern European systems are running already on heat networks much more effectively and with a higher penetration than we do here. So lost opportunities, yes, but I think 50% of that 10-point plan is actually for the UK to show our mettle, to show our innovation, and potentially additional value and export capability in those technologies. And we don't make solar modules, and they're low value, low margin products. So possibly that's why we're not in that space.
I think I agree with you. There is a link to what we can be showing the UK as leaders in and potentially on the export. I think this is something we've been discussing within our board and things like that. I'm looking at the time. I've got 4 minutes before I have to wrap up. So for the remaining panel members, quite brief responses. So maybe I can turn to Julian next.
Yeah, so we welcome the 10-point plan. Obviously, what we really need to see, though, is the energy white paper, hopefully in the next few weeks, and then hopefully closely followed by an energy bill at some point, maybe next year. And that combined with the spending review today, hopefully very soon we're going to get a full picture as to what it is the government ambition is and how to put in their money behind it.
Yeah, thank you. And Juliet, your view?
Obviously, we welcome a 10-point plan. It's great to see this kind of leadership going on. My one comment on it would be it is a mixture of technological, end user, and kind of upfront R&D measures. And I think understanding this, I think the white paper will be useful to kind of understand the overall piece, because there is a way, in order this market is going to work, and the way that we're going to move forward on zero carbon overall, and it has to coordinate. Because as we've talked about today, the systems are complex. We're going to start to add the integration of consumer in this marketplace, which has never really been seen before. And so I'd love to see that kind of vision that I think somebody talked about earlier, of how does this feel, this marketplace, and where are the key interactions between whether it's regulation networks, consumer and R&D. And that's what I would like to see as it expressed in a kind of bigger vision form.
Thank you. And coming to Alex as our sponsor, finishing with yourself and your views.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really positive step, and we've noted that there's a lot of investment into what we see as quite high value areas, whether that be hydrogen or CCUS or nuclear. They've got potentially really high value to the system. But there's also some interesting kind of parts that are maybe a little bit hidden away in the setting up of this new task force, and the description of that is around ensuring that they use systems thinking to address the net zero challenge, but also the explicit mention of carbon pricing, which is likely to have a pretty big impact if implemented correctly.
Thanks so much. Traditionally, we would say if there was one thing that you would like to see in the Chancellor's budget that's going to be issued at 12:30 in a few minutes' time, maybe you could let me all know so that we can then finish off. What would you like to see in that statement? Alex, go ahead. What would be that one thing?
Some funding for helping to quickly develop supply chains for delivery of infrastructure.
Fantastic. Juliet?
I guess it's, I'm not sure if it's going to be in this budget or not. I'd like to see the market incentives really integrate some of the challenges we've got across the board. So it shouldn't be about gigawatt hours, it should be about frequency storage, the whole gamut, in terms of what we deliver into this market to provide the long-term investment signals, and also maybe EIS coming back. So that's a tax exemption for investments that are coming through.
Great, yeah. And Julian?
So I think I'd love to see sort of incentives around development of some long-term storage, whether that's pumped hydro or some sort of really large-scale, long-term seasonal storage facilities.
Oh, fantastic. I love that one, since we look at long-term storage in the REA. And Ross?
I would like to see large-scale implementation of heat pumps in conservation areas and in heritage buildings, and I would also like to see some funding to help begin to build the skills that I talked about in the public sector, so that they can be well matched as clients to the private sector as well.
Fantastic. And Chris, to finish off?
Yep. We'd like to see extension of the call for evidence for including biogas into the main gas system of the UK, to include the opportunity to provide hydrogen. Yep. So piggyback on the biogas injection into ammonia.
That's perfect. Green gas certification schemes, market instruments, fabulous. So it's just past 12:30, and I know we're going to be finishing. So I want to, everybody who's joined, to thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get through them all. I'm sure we'll collect them all and have a go at answering them with the EI and the Energy Systems Catapult. But I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel and their time for participating. From my point of view, there's some of the key themes that have come through, starting with the last ones we heard about, building the skills, seeing the government to be more coordinating and creating that larger framework, and also working with everybody else who's participating to become believers in this energy transition, that it can happen and that there are massive opportunities for you to play. And also, I'm going to finally say a thank you to the Energy Institute for holding such a webinar, because we've touched on a massive range of topics. We might not have come up with all the answers, but I hope we've given everybody some food for thought. So thank you very much for everybody joining in this webinar today. Thank you.